Everyone can make a difference, is what the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has delivered as a message to mark World Refugee Day. What can we do to help ease the pain of refugees and asylum seekers out there around the globe? Let's find out in this episode of The Brief. Hello and welcome to The Brief. I'm Jafar Hasnan. Now, June 20th is celebrated as World Refugee Day every year. The day is dedicated to raising awareness of the situation of refugees throughout the world. The UN's Refugee Agency, known as UNHCR, and countless civic groups around the world also take time to recognize and applaud the contribution made to millions of displaced persons worldwide who have been forced to flee their homes due to war, conflict and persecution, as well as poverty. Especially during this coronavirus pandemic, as UN Secretary General António Guterres has put it into words, quote, "The COVID-19 pandemic poses an additional threat to refugees and displaced people, who are among the most vulnerable. It is a duty for governments to ensure that they are included in all response and recovery efforts." Now, by the end of 2019, 79.5 million individuals were forcibly displaced worldwide as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, and human rights violation. That was an increase of 8.7 million people over the previous year. New displacement also remains very high. One person becomes displaced every 2 seconds. Can you imagine that? That's at least 900 people who are going to be newly displaced when this episode ends in half an hour. So what kind of contributions can we give to refugees and all the civic organizations that are dealing with the issue? What do governments and policymakers have to do in order to prevent more people from being forcibly displaced? How should we mark this year's World Refugee Day? We will discuss all this and more in this episode of The Brief. But first, in order to set up the discussion for today, let's have a look at this report.
Turkey marked World Refugee Day on Saturday by calling on the international community to show solidarity with refugees and asylum seekers during the coronavirus pandemic. The Turkish Foreign Ministry said in a statement, "We hope that the World Refugee Day will lead to a period in which the number of refugees will decrease. Durable solutions, both in terms of quality and quantity, will increase, and further solidarity with these people by host countries will be displayed." Underlining that COVID-19 has further exacerbated the conditions of the vulnerable persons, it said protecting refugees and asylum seekers and ensuring their rapid and efficient access to basic services, especially healthcare, have become even more essential. It also stressed that Turkey drew attention to the situation of refugees during the pandemic and emphasized the need for international cooperation, calling on all stakeholders, especially donor countries, to take action in line with more equitable burden and responsibility sharing. It said improving the living conditions of refugees and asylum seekers and finding durable solutions to their problems are common responsibility and duty of the international community. It also invited all stakeholders to implement the UN's Global Compact on Refugees initiative established in 2018. Stop.
Welcome back. Now, unfortunately, in many countries across the world, refugees are treated unfairly. And we hope that in today's episode of The Brief, we can at least spread some awareness about who are refugees and those who seek to migrate to other countries. Let's quickly take a look at some of the latest numbers of migration coming from the United Nations. Now, 79.5 million people forcibly displaced worldwide at the end of 2019. I would like to emphasize on the number again, 79.5 million. 1% of the world's population is displaced, 80% of displaced people are affected by food insecurity. I mean, it's tragic to even think about it. 40% of displaced people are children. I got the opportunity to visit the Turkish and Greek border in the early months of 2020, in other words, pre-corona times. And what I witnessed there is tragic, to say the least. It cannot be described in words. So many people out there, but they were being met with excessive force from the Greek authorities. Why is that? How can human beings treat children like this? I know you have these questions on your mind. This is what I was wondering when I was standing there. Now, top hosting countries in the world. Turkey, 3.6 million Syrian refugees. In fact, Turkey, as you see on your screens, is one country which hosts the highest number of refugees anywhere in the world. Now, most of the refugees here are Syrian, but apart from Syrian refugees, there are many other nationalities present as well. After Turkey, Colombia hosts about 1.8 million refugees. Then Pakistan hosts about 1.4 million refugees. Uganda, 1.4 million. And Germany, 1.1 million refugees. Now, it just popped up in my mind. When I look at these countries, these are not the world leaders. I mean, there are countries which are doing much better than these countries. There are countries which have many more resources, but why don't they host refugees? What is the reason behind it? Why? We'll try to find answers to those questions as well. Now, top source countries. Syria, 6.6 million refugees. Venezuela, 3.7 million refugees. Afghanistan, 2.7 million refugees. South Sudan, 2.2. Myanmar, 1.1 million refugees. So, let's discuss this further. Joining us now is Mr. Peter van der Auwaard. He is the Chief of Mission in Bosnia for the International Organization for Migration. He's joining us from Bosnia. And then from the United States, we have Professor Wendy Perlman, Middle East Politics Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies in Northwestern University. She's also author of, quote, "We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria," which will also be published in Turkish next month. So to our Turkish audience, please keep an eye out for that. And also from the US, we have Ms. Noor Ghazal Aswad, a British Syrian migrant currently in the US, a PhD candidate on post-coloniality, immigration, liberatory social movement, and border rhetorics. She's joining us from Tennessee. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us on this episode of The Brief. Professor Perlman, I would like to start with you. You have interviewed Syrian refugees yourself. Please help us understand the plight of these refugees.
Well, the plight has many dimensions. The first thing that I've learned when speaking to Syrian refugees is that we shouldn't see them only as refugees, that being displaced from Syria isn't the start of their lives and their plight. It isn't the end of their lives and their plight. It's one stage along an ongoing journey and struggle for dignity, for freedom, for opportunity, for respect, and for belonging. So when I interviewed Syrian refugees, one of the first things that people always emphasize is the beginning of the Syrian struggle, which we know, and as Noor has written about very recently, began as a popular uprising against an authoritarian regime, a revolution for freedom and for change that was met with horrific violence on the part of the Assad regime. The opposition also took up arms, and it escalated to the very complicated multidimensional war we have today, which has led to the killing of well over 500,000 Syrians and the displacement of over half of the country from their homes. There are some 6.6 million Syrians who are internally displaced, including many now on the border of Turkey that have been displaced even in recent months with escalation of fighting in Idlib province. And as you said, some 6.6 million Syrians are refugees outside the country, the most in countries on Syria's borders, and about 1 million or so seeking asylum or having received asylum in Europe. And as your opening remarks very correctly mentioned, many fewer numbers elsewhere in the world, which leads us to wonder why countries like my own, the United States, is not doing much more to accept more asylum seekers and refugees into its country. So we need to understand the Syrian refugee crisis, as some would say, in the context of the Syrian war, the Syrian struggle for liberation that is ongoing, and see Syrians in this context of this larger struggle, listen to their voices, their narratives, to understand who they are, what they want, what they seek, and what they need to achieve dignity and respect and freedom and opportunity in the countries in which they are now refugees, to understand if they want to return to Syria or not, or under what conditions, to see how they seek opportunities in work, in education, the desire for dignified housing, for proper opportunities for children so they're not destined to work in child labor, and so forth. That's a way to start us out the discussion, I think, putting the Syrian refugee crisis in its larger context.
Absolutely, and we have a Syrian with us as well. Noor Ghazal Aswad is also with us from the U.S. Now, Noor, you recently wrote an article in which you argued that refugees, we have to shift our views on refugees from as mere victims of, quote, social underworld to revolutionaries. Please help us understand, what do you mean when you say that?
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. So this article was kind of part of a larger campaign called The 100 Faces of the Syrian Revolution. And it's kind of grassroots activists from got together, trying to shed light on the voices, on the actual individuals or the faces behind the Syrian revolution. And that includes protesters, it includes revolutionaries, it includes doctors who are working in underground hospitals under bombing. It includes cameramen, who, regular people who took up cameras to document the atrocities of the Assad regime. And so by doing this, when it Refugee Day, I began to see that the media coverage of refugees has really kind of centralized the idea, the spectacle of, which is certainly part of the reality of Syrian refugees, sadly, but it's hardly the whole kind of picture. And so we see refugees at the border. We see them strewn on the Mediterranean Sea, like the famous image of Alan Kurdi, that young boy who was kind of, thrown dead in the sea. Or we see the weaponization of refugees by geopolitical powers. And so all of that is definitely part of the conflict, and it's important to remember this. But, Syrian refugees are hardly only victims. They're also, we have to remember that the Syrian quote-unquote civil war was in fact the center of one of the most inspiring radical revolutions in recent. And Syrians came out from under repression. They knowingly put their lives on the line. They knew that they were risking imprisonment. They were facing death. They came out from under kingdom of silence to fight for a better life, for social change, to make a better life for themselves and for others. And so by kind of shifting how we see the refugee as this kind of apolitical, silent victim to a person who has agency and courage and autonomy, really kind of gives us a better idea of the full figure of the refugee. And also, like Dr. Perlman was saying, their lives before they became refugees is really an important part of the analysis.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, Mr. Peter van der Auwaard, let me come to you. Recently, the United Nations said that they are alarmed by reports Greece is forcing out asylum seekers. Now, I have seen it personally myself at the border between Turkey and Greece. People, or perhaps some countries, especially within the European Union, are not fond of accepting refugees. I want you to explain what is the root cause behind it. Why so much hatred towards refugees?
Well, I think that if we talk about Europe, the hatred is, as a storyboard, is only one part of the story. I think there is a tendency to focus maybe on people that are anti-migrant, anti-refugee in Europe, and these people do exist. But I would like to counterbalance that with the image that we have tens of thousands of people across the European Union as volunteers, as individual citizens, who actually have positive attitudes and very understanding attitudes towards refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. If you look at the success of extreme right-wing parties, while it can be alarming to see a party that is extreme right-wing getting 15 or 20% of the vote, and we should take that seriously, it still means that 80% of the people do not vote for this type of party. So I think there is a little bit of an imbalanced view as to attitudes in Europe, especially in the media and through social media, where often the most radical voices are the loudest and therefore somehow get associated with what is going on in Europe as a whole. The second point, I think when it comes to, obviously, border management is an important component of migration management, but that always needs to happen with respect for the access to asylum, and certainly always with the absence of violence. And you saw that there was a joint statement of UNHCR and my own organization, IOM, calling out, expressing alarm at the use of violence at the borders. And that should be avoided. It's not avoided. It's not to be avoided. It should not happen. It's not in accordance with the values that Europe pertains to stand by. And if you use violence against migrants and refugees, that is not something that, of course, it affects first and utmost the victims of that violence, but it also poisons your own society. And I think that's where we should all be concerned about the use of violence of forces, whether it's border police or police, against migrants, because that affects the whole of society. It's not just something that affects the people that are the direct victims of that, of course.
Okay. Now, Professor Perlman, let me come to you. Unfortunately, we live in a world where this anti-refugee rhetoric prevails. Now, of course, unfortunately, again, being a refugee is hard. But on top of that, if you are a Muslim refugee, it becomes worse. Why do you think Muslim refugees are stigmatized?
Well, this is the larger question of Islamophobia that is a problem in many Western and majority Christian societies, that there's a tremendous amount of lack of awareness about the realities of Islam and what it means to be Muslim. There are stereotypes. Some of this stretches to, in the United States, the 9/11, the war on terror, but certainly goes much beyond this to a deeply complicated long history between the so-called West and the so-called Muslim world. But I think that there's a lot of lack of awareness. I mean, in my own interviews of interviewing displaced Syrians in various European countries, and also European members of host societies, I came across all sorts of strange stereotypes of Germans thinking, oh, there's so many Syrians here, are they going to force my sister or my wife to wear a headscarf? Are we suddenly not going to be able to eat pork in Europe, and so forth? And I found a deep concern among many Europeans that there would be some sort of Islamization of their societies. When I talk to Syrian refugees, these types of concerns could not be further from their daily lives and their concerns. People were worried about getting good jobs. They were worried about getting their children through school so they could see their children be successful. They were worried about legal status so they wouldn't be precarious and being vulnerable to being deported. They were worried about their families back home in Syria who were still living under bombs. They were worried about their loved ones who had been arrested and detained by the Assad regime, and they didn't know if they were dead or alive. There were concerns about life and death and dignity. Everything from the bureaucratic processes of asylum to the nuts and bolts of finding an apartment. They did not at all see their Islam and their faith, which most people saw as a private matter of how they prayed and to whom they prayed, and their own piety as having anything to do with their capacity to live decent lives in Europe and with full respect to their European neighbors, and nothing that should block them from getting the full respect of their European neighbors in return. So I think that the basic rules of treating others with respect, of treating others the way you would want them to treat you, of respecting difference, but still seeing that there is a place in all societies where people of different religions and different ideas and different languages and ethnicities can come and live together. And with mutual respect, there is no reason to think that these societies can't thrive together. So I would urge anyone who has fears about Muslims to recognize their own Islamophobia and see that has very little connection to the reality of these Muslim asylum seekers and refugees who've sought safety, refuge, and opportunity within their borders.
Well said, Professor Perlman. Now, Noor, let me come to you. Same question. What do you think is the best way to spread awareness when it comes to Muslim refugees?
So you raise an important point, obviously, this global Islamophobia, where we see the Muslim refugees kind of weaponized. Obviously, there are historic reasons for the reason that this is the case, but they are otherized, they are orientalized, they are seen as not human, either as terrorists or diseased immigrants, and so there's a lot there behind that. But also seeing that many conservative parties, like Peter was saying, they deliberately kind of manipulate the public attitudes for political benefit. And so, but I think it's important to realize things are shifting now. I think with COVID-19 and this pandemic, we're seeing some really interesting currents happening and shifts in attitude where this kind of the imagined risk of refugee entry is no longer as important as the risk of the pandemic. And then you see this us versus them rhetoric is also now not working in the same way, and it's not resonating in the same way. So for instance, in Germany now, in Saxony, which is the heartland of conservative Germany, we're seeing how, in fact, the same parties that were kind of shaming Merkel for accepting refugees are now actually calling on Syrian doctors to enroll and help alleviate the medical. And so there's a realization that we refugees need to be part of the solution, and we can't afford to think of them as separate anymore. And so things have been changing, and I think the pandemic has played a big role in that.
Okay, absolutely. Now, Mr. Aurad, let me come to you. Over the past few months, especially, many organizations, in fact, even the United Nations has received criticism for not doing enough to help the plight of refugees. Do you think organizations such as the UN and such as the organization you work for are playing their role in help ease the pain or not?
Well, I mean, I think that, of course, you have individual or you have particular contexts where my own organization, another UN agency could do more, that you need to look at each country. But there is a limitation in the sense that international organizations, first of all, can only do as much as their member states fund them to do. I mean, it's maybe lacks of some taste to talk about money, but at the end of the day, if you have a large displacement crisis, a large refugee crisis, and there is no funding to provide, let's put it very bluntly, sufficient food for 1 million or 2 million internally displaced people, as IOM or as a UN, you can want to do as much as you like, but if you only have money for 100,000 people, well, that's the number of people you're going to feed. And sometimes the criticism is related to that. So then you come back to member states of the United Nations, the states with money, that maybe they should put more money in certain forgotten crises or in certain ongoing crises that are underfunded. The other part, and you see that also here in the Western Balkans, when an organization like my own operates, let's say in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and a perennial problem here has been a lack of accommodation for migrants and refugees. Now, IOM depends on the authorities to decide to establish this type of accommodation. As IOM, as an international organization, you cannot go around and start establishing camps or buildings without any type of political decision-making. So it's not just the money. You're also dependent on the politics in the place where you operate as IOM or UN agency to do it determines what you can do. That is not mean to say that there are not instances where I know myself in Bosnia-Herzegovina, there were things that I could have done differently and where we could have done better from the word go. And like any organization, you make mistakes. I don't think that we should claim to be holier than thou, and we also make mistakes. That's not the problem. But our actions are limited on the one hand by the funding and by the politics, and very often these two are, of course, connected.
Okay. Now, Professor Perlman, it makes me wonder, do some countries think that as long as refugees are not their problem, they don't care? We have seen countries decreasing funding for refugees. We have seen countries closing their borders like Greece did about a few months ago. I mean, what is the solution to this?
But I think precisely as Peter's saying, it's the dilemma of the system we have of nation states that in a world system that recognizes and respects the sovereignty of governments to determine their policies, the capacity of the international community to resolve global dilemmas, to respect human rights, is limited by often the self-interest of individual states. And I think it is the case that many states, if they see a problem as not being theirs, because it's far enough away, then they will do all they can to ignore it and not share responsibility for humanitarian catastrophes. And I think that's what those of us who work on these topics are always trying to emphasize, our shared humanity. Just because a refugee is far away or from a different religion or looks different or country that you may have never heard of or is not of your own community, doesn't mean that there's not some shared humanity that should make you want to care about this person and do what you can, because refugees are simply seeking safety. And seeking safety should not be illegal, and it should not be turned away. But there's a political reality that states are often self-interested. And so one approach is to try to work from the grassroots to develop and try to foster citizen caring and help citizens across the world overcome either their hatred or their apathy to do what they can. Because if there's a public mandate coming from below that people themselves want to accept more refugees, they want to offer more rights to refugees, they want to offer more of their own dollars and tax monies to support humanitarian well-being, then maybe governments can feel pressured to respond. But as long as Peter was saying earlier, the loudest voices are the anti-refugee voices, that might just take the day. So the question is for all of those who don't identify with an anti-refugee sort of sentiment, where are our voices, and what can we do to increase the volume of our voices to make a more humane policy around the world?
Absolutely. Now, Noor, let me come to you. You are a Syrian yourself. Unfortunately, right now, many of our Syrian brothers and sisters are living or are perhaps scattered across the world. So my question is, do you think the international community has done enough for these refugees, or there is still a lot more that can be done?
And I think it goes without saying that the international community has completely failed to stand in solidarity with Syrians. And that includes both the right and the left, where the refugee crisis is and the root cause, obviously, is the Assad regime, which has killed more than 94% of the killings that have happened in Syria. And so nobody has really been able to protect Syrians. Humanitarian aid has not been reaching the right people. They have been left forgotten. I mean, that's how Syrians feel. There has not been solidarity from the West in any meaningful way, aside from platitudes and words. And so that's why so many Syrians like myself are so pained, and we are speaking out to kind of remind people that we once believed in international solidarity. We once believed in standing with the oppressed, and especially now with Black Lives Matter in America and this whole movement to really stand in solidarity and side by side with the oppressed. It's more critical than ever that we don't sit on our laurels now and we really pay attention to what's happening. It's one of the worst humanitarian crises of our age, I think.
Okay. Now, Mr. Awart, I would like to come to you. What do you need, or what does your organization need from the international community? I guess this is a question which is not asked usually to organizations. What do you need from the international community?
Well, I think I want to go back to something that Wendy said, which I think is very important. At the end of the day, an organization like ION or the UN can only get as much support as governments are willing to give it. Now, when you talk about that in a democratic context, like let's say, for example, Germany or Belgium, where I'm from, that means that you need to create a platform in that country where you have enough people that vote for parties that are willing to show solidarity with the oppressed, that are willing to show solidarity with the weakest amongst us, whether it's at home for our own people or for the refugees and the migrants that come. So in the sense that where an organization like IOM needs resources and political support, well, that can only come, as Wendy pointed out, if you have a sufficient critical mass of people in the ground, especially when you talk in democratic context, like, as I said, Belgium or Germany, who support this type of approach. And I think to a certain degree, in Europe, we're paying the price, I think, of the left in the past decades, not paying enough attention that we not just need to receive migrants and refugees, but we also need to create an environment and we need to address issues related to local population and migrants and refugees to create greater understanding and put a lot more effort into integration. And that, I think, has not happened, which is now then, of course, feeding this xenophobic rhetoric on the right that is anti-migrant and anti-refugee. So it's really critical to invest in the grassroots, in the societies that do have the means to increase their solidarity with the weaker and those that have been affected by conflict around the world.
Absolutely. Now, Professor Perlman, unfortunately, I was just reading this news that came out of Greece recently. Greece has extended lockdown on more than 120,000 migrants. You know, coronavirus has wreaked havoc across the world. Many people in those refugee camps were infected. I mean, where is humanity? We know coronavirus is a deadly virus. These people are trapped inside one camp, and now they have extended the lockdown. It almost seems like they're willfully trying to get rid of these people.
Well, I wouldn't comment on whether it's a willful desire to create a situation in which corona spreads, but I think that as we've, and my fellow guests have been saying, these are short-sighted, short-term, almost knee-jerk policies of governments that simply do not want to welcome in those who are seeking safety and have nowhere else to go. Those are the sort of anti-refugee policies that we're seeing in different forms and in different places, depending on the government and their situation, whether it's what you just described in Greece, whether it's calls in different countries for refugees to go home. They're all different expressions of the same basic crisis. But I really want to echo Noor's point here in that to continue to see, for example, the Syrian crisis in the larger context of the Syrian conflict. And when you're talking about this sort of anti-refugee sentiment and the lack of solidarity and the lack of humanity, that it applies not only to those Syrians who've been forced from Syria, but also to the larger Syrian conflict and those inside Syria and the larger and ongoing war, the main engine of which is the Assad regime. And the international community has abandoned the root cause of the Syrian crisis, which is encouraging some sort of resolution, some sort of accountability and justice, some sort of civilian protection for those in Syria, some sort of end to the crimes of the Assad regime and the suffering of the Syrian people. So we have two dimensions of this crisis. Those who fled Syria and are seeking dignity and opportunity and safety need to be welcomed and given opportunity to create new lives. And the root cause, the Syrian conflict, and specifically the Assad regime's role in fueling that conflict that forces civilians to flee in the first place, that needs to be addressed too, and that also demands the energies and the will and the commitment of the international community, which, as Noor said, has been absent for far too long, but is absolutely required should there be any resolution to what people call this refugee crisis.
Absolutely. Well said, Professor Perlman, and it's all a part of spreading awareness. I mean, Noor, let me come to you. What do Syrian refugees want at the moment? Please tell us. Please be their voice and tell our audience, what do Syrian refugees want?
So I think that's a good question. And the thing is, I cannot speak for Syrian refugees. We cannot speak for them, on behalf of them. We need to speak to them and listen to them and walk side by side with them. And only then can we mobilize this non-conditional solidarity with Syrian refugees. For far too often, you see journalists standing with refugees behind them in the camps, speaking for them. And that's why I love Dr. Perlman's book, because she actually doesn't even translate. She lets them speak for themselves. And so without, as she said, we need to open the borders, we need to accept them, but also we need to realize this is an active conflict. It's not safe for Syrians to return yet. We've seen cases where refugees have spoken out. So recently there was Mazen Hamada, who was a refugee in the Netherlands, who was speaking out on the atrocities of the Assad regime, and he went back under promises from the regime that he would be given safety and to see his family, and he was captured, and we haven't seen from him since. He's been disappeared, essentially. And that's just one small example of how Syrians feel. As long as the Assad regime is in power, there is no way for Syrians to return to their country, which they love and which they miss, and which they obviously, they didn't leave voluntarily. In many ways, they were forced out. If that answers your question, but I really think it's essential that we centralize the voices of Syrians, and from we will know how we need to act in solidarity with them.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we'll have to close the discussion now. Mr. Peter van der Auwert and Professor Wendy Perlman and Noor Ghazal Aswad, thank you very much for talking to us on The Brief. We really appreciate your analysis, and thank you very much for doing what you guys do. May God bless you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and now we will continue with our special transmission on coronavirus pandemic. Now, cinemas, museums and galleries in the UK, one of the nations hardest hit by the global pandemic, can reopen from early next month. Let's find out more about it in this report, then I'll be back with you.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced on Tuesday that cinemas, museums and galleries in England can reopen from next month.
From the 4th of July, provided that no more than 2 households stay together, people will be free to stay overnight in self-contained accommodation, including hotels and bed and breakfasts, as well as campsites, as long as shared facilities are kept clean. Most leisure facilities and tourist attractions will reopen if they can do so safely, including outdoor gyms and playgrounds, cinemas, museums, galleries, theme parks and arcades, as well as libraries, social clubs and community centres.
It will be the next stage in a gradual return to normality for the economy, as the number of COVID-19 deaths and cases decline in one of the worst-hit nations of the global pandemic. The 4th of July will see some higher-risk venues, like those in the arts and cultural sector, allowed to reopen their doors in England. But there will be strict rules to maintain social distancing. Johnson also announced findings of a review into whether to relax the current rule that people must maintain a distance of 2 meters at all times to prevent the spread of the virus.
We will advise people to keep a social distance of 1 meter plus, meaning they should remain 1 meter apart while taking mitigations to reduce the risk of transmission.
He's faced increasing lobbying from businesses and political pressure in his own party to drop the 2 meter rule. Finance Minister Rishi Sunak announced that relaxing the rule would make a huge difference to many businesses. Pubs and restaurants have called for the distance to be reduced to 1 meter, the minimum recommended by the World Health Organization.
All right, welcome back. Coronavirus has wreaked havoc across the world. So far, hundreds of thousands of people have died, millions have been infected. Now, everyone is wondering, when will this pandemic end? Unfortunately, we do not have an answer to this question yet, but reports indicate that unless we have a vaccine, this pandemic will not be over. When will a vaccine be made? That's another question. Well, the timeline looks like 1 year or maybe more than 1 year. The earliest possible date would be the end of 2020. Until then, how can we protect ourselves? What can we do to make sure we do not contract the virus? Well, practice all the measures that have been announced by authorities. Practice social distancing. Do not go to crowded areas. Wear a face mask. Keep your hand sanitized. As long as we take all these precautions, it's highly unlikely that we contract coronavirus. Now, the world is changing. Coronavirus causes many symptoms ranging from sore throat, fever, loss of sense of taste and smell, and also something related to the eye. What is that? Let's discuss this further. Now joining us from Istanbul is Mr. Sinan Göker. He is an eye doctor based in Turkey. Thank you very much for being with us, Doctor. You have seen coronavirus over the last few months wreaking havoc across the globe. What I would like to ask you is how coronavirus has affected your work here in Turkey.
Coronavirus actually, as you know, affects the lungs the most seriously. But just like the flu virus, it also affects the eyes, but it's not as important as the lungs or the other serious tissues. So, of course, with the coronavirus and the lockdown, our branch like eyes, ophthalmology, of course, our work is stopped because of the lockdown, because our surgeries, which is my expertise, the laser and the cataract surgery, it's not essential. So we stopped doing those operations, but with the easing, so slowly the life went back to normal. So now we also started doing all our operations. People, not as much as before, but maybe 50% were working, and life is coming back slowly.
Yes, life is coming back slowly. Now, as you mentioned, coronavirus mostly affects the lungs, but reports have emerged from some countries that coronavirus is also affecting the eye. It's causing something called conjunctivitis. Can you please help us understand what is it all about?
Of course, I mean, coronavirus comes in the body from the lungs, but then it distributes all the tissues of the body. And just like a flu virus, you know, people get conjunctivitis. I mean, they have watery eyes, the eyes get red and swollen, which is called the conjunctivitis. So just like the flu virus, also in all kind of coronavirus cases, there is some degree of conjunctivitis. But now we know better the situation. It's not there's no transmission through the secretions or tears. It's not the virus doesn't transmit with the tears or the secretions from the eye coming with the conjunctivitis. So conjunctivitis is just like a side effect, we can say. It's not so mainly eyes doesn't get affected very much.
Okay, so is there a treatment for conjunctivitis or not, or does it go away on its own?
It goes away. It goes away on itself. Just like the viruses, there's no treatment in like flu virus also. So we just give some symptomatic drops, to get the patient relief. And then when the body takes over the virus, then it goes away.
Okay, now, Doctor, you mentioned earlier before we started this interview that in your clinic you perform some sort of your expertise on patients, on about 90% of your patients. What is that all about? Can you please tell our audience?
Yes, this is actually my expertise. It's called cataract and refractive surgery. Refractive surgery means the laser treatment for the myopia and hyperopia. I've been doing the laser for 28 years in Turkey. And the cataract surgery also, the technique called phaco, I've been doing it for 30 years. So the latest trend in these techniques, and it's getting very popular, is to get rid of the reading glasses. We started doing the lens replacement surgery. It's the actual surgery. In the lens replacement surgery, we take the lens, original lens, out and put a new synthetic lens. And the new lenses, the technology improved a lot for the last years. I've been putting this multifocal lenses, which has the multifocus for 13 years. But for the last few years, the technology really advanced. So we do this lens replacement surgery, put a new multifocal lens in the eye. So after the operation, people start to read without glasses and also see distance without glasses, and all their lives. The numbers doesn't come back again. And the patients doesn't have the cataracts, will not need any cataract surgery in the future. Of course, we put the best lenses. So the new, for the last maybe 6 months, the best lenses came out. They are called the trifocal lenses. By means of the trifocal lenses, people can read the smallest letters, like drug prescriptions, without glasses. And they see also the mid-distance without glasses. And they see the distance. They can drive a car and do all kind of daily work without glasses all their life. And it's a very easy operation, just a 10 minutes operation, even 7 minutes, I can tell. And we do it by drops, just putting anesthetic drops, no pain. So next day, when the patients come to my office, they start to see, without glasses, distance, near and mid-distance, and the numbers doesn't come back again all their lives. Wow. And they don't need any cataract operation in the future, because the cataract operation will be done.
Here? I mean, are there any side effects possible? All right, and now this brings us to the end of another episode of The Brief. We would like to thank once again Mr. Sinan Göker for being with us on this episode. Now, coronavirus pandemic continues to wreak havoc across the world. Unfortunately, so far, hundreds of thousands of people have died. Talking about coronavirus here in Turkey, we have seen some positive developments taking place over the past few weeks. But again, we have to be vigilant. We have to take all the precautions. We have to ensure that we practice social distancing and keep ourselves, our hands sanitized. Now, I know many of you are frustrated with the COVID-19 pandemic. We all want to return back to normalcy. But one thing is certain, there will be a new normal. What used to be normal before the pandemic might not be with us when this virus is over. But this is how the world evolves. There have been many pandemics in the past, but human beings live, and we will live. Hopefully this pandemic will be over soon, sooner than we expect it to be over, and hopefully one day I will get the opportunity to say this. On that note, I'm Jafar Hasnan. I'll see you with the next episode of The Brief on Thursday.